Should you take a job in a startup or a big tech company? In today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about startup versus big company life. If you're trying to decide if a startup versus big tech is right for you, tap that like button and let's jump straight into it. So you have to start before you actually get in the door, and that is with hiring. When you're interviewing with a big tech company, they are going to have a more structured process. This isn't to say that it's going to be exceptionally formal, suit and tie, because let's face it, even in big tech, there probably isn't going to be a suit and tie involved in your interview. But big tech companies have very established interviewing and hiring procedures. You are going to meet with a specific number of people in specific roles at specific levels, and they are trained interviewers who are going to be asking you more specific questions, which you need to actually answer in a more particular way. Now, all of this is completely exposed by a startup. Now, while startup hiring processes can completely run the gamut, they tend to be fast and they tend to have less structure. And if big tech interviews didn't already skew to be informal enough, tech startups tend to be very informal. I have actually had a hiring manager refuse to proceed with a candidate because he showed up in a suit and tie. Also, at a startup, they're not going to have the rigorous hiring process. So they might have steps that they're following, but it's not necessarily going to be as fleshed out. I've also had several clients that have interviewed at startups where they have just invented processes along the way to help them make their decision. So some startups, it can be a little bit chaotic, but as that startup gets bigger and bigger, it is going to be a little bit more processized and a little bit more predictable. But there's something that you want to know before you sign the dotted line, way more than that. You want to know about the money, and that leads us into our next difference between tech startup versus big company, and that is compensation. The big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Salesforce are all competing for top talent. And one of the main ways that they are actually competing in order to get the best people working on their teams is to be offering above market compensation. That means, my friends, above market salaries. Because the big tech companies generally have levels that they are going to be offering you a job at, there might be an actual ceiling in terms of salary compensation that they can offer. I have worked with a couple of clients who have hit this. So it is something for you to be aware of in the negotiation, and also in terms of considering if that offer is going to be right for you. Startups, on the other hand, can pay just as well, or they can pay terribly. In my experience, tech startup compensation really does run the gamut in terms of having above market salaries to like really, really low, but with really high equity. Generally, there is going to be some level of calibration, and this is going to be influenced by things like the stage of the tech startup, what your actual role is, what level you're coming in at, and all of that kind of thing. I will be talking more about startup compensation and startup salaries in a video coming out soon. So if you haven't already, make sure and subscribe, because if you are leaning startup, you are not going to want to miss that video. Now that we've talked about the considerations that happen before you get in the door, the really important ones are obviously once you actually get hired at either a startup or a big tech company. Now we need to talk about the difference between a big company versus startup when you actually get into the door. So let's begin with onboarding. When you start your job at a big tech company, you are walking into a well-oiled machine. They have a set orientation process. They have training. You'll probably have a peer mentor. They have literally onboarded tens of thousands of people into their company, and they know exactly how to do it efficiently and effectively. They have entire teams that are dedicated to this process. So your onboarding with a big tech company is going to be fairly easy and pretty guided. In a startup, on the other hand, you're here. Start working. I'm only kind of kidding here. Again, this is something that is totally being generalized because this is going to be influenced once again by the stage and the maturity of the startup. But especially if you're coming into an early stage company, there is not going to be probably any process, and you're going to need to figure out how to get yourself onboarded. Whereas at a bigger tech startup, they may actually have onboarding in place. So it can really, again, run the gamut. And the important thing for you to do is to consider the size of the company, and it might be even something that you ask about in an interview. But I generally find that until a startup gets to a stage where they actually have a team that is dedicated to onboarding, or at least a person that is dedicated to onboarding, it tends to skew much more to trial by fire versus a guided, hand-holding, structured onboarding process like what you would find at a big tech company. And this actually brings me directly to my next difference between a startup versus big company, and this is one of the biggest ones. Your actual role and responsibilities. When you are working at a big tech company, you know exactly what you need to do. Your role is very well defined. You don't need to go outside of the lines frequently, if at all. And all of the roles and all of the levels are completely laid out. The exception would be is if you're on a newer, more entrepreneurial team. But for the most part, when you are working at a big tech company, that definition is going to mean that you get to focus just on doing your actual job. But if you're at a startup, you're generally going to be wearing several hats, if not all of the hats, sometimes at the same time. And the earlier stage and the less people that are actually at the startup, the more dynamic your role is probably going to be. This means that if you choose the startup life, you might actually get experience that you wouldn't get until you were in a senior level role or even a leadership role because of the dynamics of a startup, which I find especially early in your career can be very interesting and can help you carve your own unique path. But on the flip side of that, you might find yourself cleaning a bathroom because the startup doesn't have the budget in order to hire a cleaner quite yet. True story, it happened to someone that I know. So, upside downside of things. And stemming from this, the next difference between a startup and a big company is, let's just call it what it is. Bureaucracy. Big tech companies generally are going to have more structure than a startup, and there's a perfectly good reason for it. They need to be able to function without everyone stepping all over each other's toes, doubling or tripling or quadrupling effort. What I'm saying is it would be absolute chaos if they didn't have some level of bureaucracy. And even if the organization still operates fairly flat, you are going to find that there is going to be hierarchies because you have different levels in the role, you have different levels of leadership, plus they figure out what actually works and they're going to replicate it. So not only are their processes going to be designed for you to be more efficient, they're also going to be designed for you to be more effective. However, on the flip side of this also comes with some other elements, such as potential increases in office politics, hierarchies, and obstacles to getting things done, especially when you're trying to get something done that requires approval of someone that is 5 pay grades higher than you are on the corporate food chain. Startups, on the other hand, tend to be the opposite of bureaucratic. I think it's kind of the whole startup life, the culture of kind of this scrappy hacker identity. And partially because the structures aren't there and the hierarchy isn't there, but also just because of the function and the startup culture in general, often you're going to find low resistance to get things done. Not always true, I can tell you that from personal experience, but it is something that you would generally be able to expect at a startup versus a big tech company. But with the decrease in barriers, there always comes a trade-off, which brings me to my next difference between a startup and a big tech company: career growth paths. At big tech companies, these are pretty much going to be laid out for you. Because each role in a big tech company generally is going to be on a ladder, you're going to know exactly what you need to do in order to climb that corporate ladder. Having it laid out and generally pretty transparent is going to make your life and your career growth journey a lot easier. Plus, when you're at a big tech company, you're going to get access to resources like training that are going to help you ascend the ranks that you want to ascend. And while when you look in the big tech companies, I know people that have ascended those ranks really, really quickly. Most people actually progress their careers in a big tech company at a fairly steady pace. This is completely juxtaposed by startup life. And while it's true that you might find yourself on a rocket ship and your career might end up growing really, really quickly just because you were in the right place at the right time, that isn't necessarily the experience that everyone has. I've spoken to many startup employees that thought that they were just gonna get into the company early and that they were just going to skyrocket, but they ended up getting stuck on the ground floor. So while in general it is going to be easier for you to grow in a growing company, this isn't always necessarily the case. And I think one of the reasons for this is because startups also tend to lack professional development infrastructure. So you're not going to have the same access to training and necessarily resources. Now, if you do choose startup life as the life that is for you, there are obviously workarounds towards this. You're just going to need to roll up your sleeves and do a little bit of this on your own. For example, you can sign up and attend my latest workshop that is going to help you define your UAQ, which is going to be something that helps you skyrocket your career along with your company. And this actually leads me to my next difference between a big tech company and a startup, and that is stability. And this is obviously something that can be pretty important in your career, especially when the economy is doing what it's doing right now. In big tech, you are generally going to have better job stability as compared to a startup. For example, one of the reasons is they have enormous amounts of cash in the bank. They're not worried about getting their next round of funding in order to sustain payroll. They also have processes to make sure that if they invite you to join your team, that you're really the best person for their team, and they're giving you the tools that you need in order to be successful. Plus, their business is more stable, which means that they need to do a lot less big pivoting, which can create a lot of disruption in terms of teams in a startup environment. And also in terms of stability, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this one, because this is something that I think people really don't think of. Working in a big tech company is going to get recruiters sliding into your DMs. And this is going to mean that your career has more stability, because even if you decide that big tech company isn't for you, you are going to have a steady stream of incoming opportunities which you can choose from. And if you are proactively applying for jobs, having a company like Google or Salesforce is going to swing some doors open for you. And obviously, this is one of the biggest differences between a tech startup and a big company, whereas startups generally have less stability. Not only are their products less established, their product market fit isn't quite established yet, they also are generally going to be reliant on money from investors versus just having a pile of money that they're sitting on like a big tech company. The path to success for a startup is a very winding road, and a ton of them actually don't make it. Does it mean that working for a startup is a terrible idea? No, I personally love working for startups, and if I had to go back to corporate, I would choose a startup myself. But depending on where you are in your career, this is something that you might want to consider. And that actually leads me to a question. Based on everything that we have been talking about over the past couple of minutes, which one are you leaning towards? Startup life or big tech? No matter which size of company you have decided is right for you, if you are new to the tech industry, your next step is going to be getting a job in tech. If you are trying to get a job in tech with no experience, go and check out this video right now where I tell you exactly how to do it. If this video was helpful, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing because I have more videos about working in tech coming out. As always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.